Heading: Liberty linked to responsibility, or individual liberty linked to individual responsibility. Another point about laws is that if people would just be good, and good based upon natural law, we would not need the government to establish laws to draw those lines for us. In the words of James Madison, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Individual independent actions have consequences, but that is what liberty is: individual independent action. Individualism is not only a social theory advocating the liberty, rights, or independent action of the individual, but also the principle or habit of or belief in independent thought or action. I think a lot of people like to condemn individualism as being egoist or selfish, definitely not community oriented, or as someone who embraces individualism as someone never considering the common good, never considering others, never considering other people's feelings, even against the natural order of social bonds and need for others. Like, if you're an individualist, you don't need society, you don't need other people, and you can treat them as badly as you wish because you're pursuing your own selfish goals. No man is an island, though, and so it becomes this idea that individualism in and of itself is bad. But even according to dictionary.com, individualism has multiple definitions. It is not just a social theory where all the people incorporate those connotations of the word, but it is a principle. It is a belief in, or it is the habit of independent, not just independent action, but independent thought. Being an independent thinker, believing in the ability for individuals to think for themselves. And of course, it is a freedom principle. Liberty, freedom of the individual, as discussed above, is about lack of coercion. Independent action, acting independently, means one is not forced to act. But liberty is not just about independent action. It includes independent thought. And we equate the word independence with what? Freedom. Individual liberty means we can act freely and think freely. Everyone used to want to be thought of as like a unique individual. There are phrases in our lexicon like think outside the box. Everyone used to want to be thought of as an independent thinker. Each child comes to a point in their very young life where they realize for the first time maybe that they're not just an appendage of their parents or siblings, and they start asserting their independence. And it can, in the American experience, or in my experience anyway, manifest in seemingly rebellious ways as we try to teach them to share, listen, obey, and they scream mine ever more loudly, deciding they won't eat the new food in front of them, refuse to simply believe what you have to say. And then later, as older children, as they are still seeking to discover who they are, there is this pressure to adopt the culture of a subgroup or a clique within their social experience. And even though most find their kind of subgroup at a young age, still there are those who want to stand out. And this might be someone with a talent no one else they know in their age group has, like a sense of humor complete with perfect timing to land a joke, or maybe it's a musical gift, maybe an athletic ability or just speed or strength, or I don't know, a knack with magic tricks, performing magic tricks. And so they want to not follow the crowd. They want to stand out. They want to be proud of their gifts and abilities, and they want other people to recognize them for them. They don't want to blend in. However, I think the acceptance into a tribe, we want this acceptance of a tribe. I think that's also kind of innate within us because community does matter. No man is an island, come to find out. So even the rebels or these standout personalities had to kind of find their own group. I think about the goths in the 80s or the nerds or whatever, but even within their group, there were so many who then even tried to stand out or lead this new group. And, if you think about it, all these movies and shows about outcasts, they still wanted to act and think outside the expected norms, at least within their little tribe, their little in-group. Liberty is about independent action and independent thought. Freedom to act without coercion and being a free thinker. But if someone is dependent on something or someone else, that person cannot be independent. Remember, independent means free. If that is so, dependent must mean the opposite. So dependent must mean not free, right? The dictionary definition of dependent, however, indicates something a little bit different. The state of not being responsible. The word dependent then indicates one is not responsible for oneself. If you are a legal dependent, for example, your parent is typically seen as being responsible for your well-being and safety. A child is not responsible for putting a roof over his own head or providing for her own sustenance. That's the parent's job. That's the parent's responsibility. Responsibility is the state of being responsible, or a burden or obligation, according to Merriam-Webster. If responsibility means burden or obligation, then if we have a responsibility, that means we carry a burden or obligation. But if responsibility is the state of being responsible, we need to know what responsible means. Having control or authority, answerable or accountable, being the agent or cause for some action. In other words, when someone is acting independently in liberty, that individual carries his own burden. The free person carries his own burden. The free person is independent instead of dependent. The free person is always responsible for the circumstances they find themselves in. The free person has control and authority over their own life. The free person is the cause and agent of their own action. The free person does not need to look to anyone else to meet their needs and desires, or to tell them what to do or what will make them happy. I hope you are paying attention to how this idea of responsibility for one's own happiness, truly, linguistically at least, is intimately entwined with freedom and liberty. Liberty equals freedom equals independence. And independence is linguistically not dependent. If, however, someone is dependent on some entity, that means someone else is responsible and carries their burden for them. But that dependency comes with a price. For example, if you are dependent on some entity for your food, that entity either chooses the food for you, like a parent, or dictates what foods you can consume or can and cannot buy. You have fewer choices, less freedom. If you are dependent on some entity for your housing, that entity can tell you where you can and cannot live, like a parent does for their children, and what you can and cannot do with that property. If you depend on some entity, like government or your parent, you have lost some freedom. You are no longer independent. You are answerable to the standards set in place by someone else, not simply answerable to yourself. you have handed over at least some authority and control of your life to someone else. Someone with the power to dictate your actions for you. Who wants to tell you what to eat and drink, where to live, how to live, assign financial costs and social costs to not complying with what they want to tell you to do? When people expect a check or benefits, the reality is there are always strings attached. Most of the time throughout this book, I am trying not to tell you how to make a connection between what I'm saying, the words on the page, and the reality we find ourselves living in right now at the moment. I actually want the reader to have his or her own epiphany. And I realize as I read now, I could have given several examples and I could have excoriated certain groups and individuals. But let's focus on the concepts and ideas. Even now, I'm not going to tell you what to think, but to think about these ideas. And then try, let's as we're reading through this, try to think for ourselves. Dependence means in the end, not responsible. But if someone else is responsible for your well-being, for your health, for your happiness, guess what? They will need the power to meet your needs and fulfill the desires they say you should have. And now, hopefully, I hope you're thinking back to the beginning of the book where, again, we discussed what democracy really is. I will beat this drum over and over. Dependence can then lead to coercion as that entity, let's say government or the sovereign or the general will, that entity can force you to do certain things. This whole line of thinking would indicate that liberty, freedom, goes hand in hand with responsibility. It should also be apparent that there is an inverse relationship between dependency and liberty. The more dependent you are on someone or something else, the less free you are. This would then seem to indicate that if we want to live in freedom, embrace liberty, we must be willing to also be responsible for our own actions and behavior. And independent actions do have consequences. I think too often we want to claim I can do whatever I want or it's a free country, but we're not really willing to pay the price or take responsibility for that freedom. The choice to do evil or the cost when our freedom comes into conflict with another person's freedom, we're not willing to take responsibility for the choices we make. We as a people, I think especially in the last few generations, have forgotten that independence as independent actions have real consequences. And if we want to be free, we have to be willing to understand what those consequences really should be. Individual liberty is contingent upon personal responsibility, as it should be obvious that liberty and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. Perhaps we so willingly hand over our liberty and freedom because we have already handed over our responsibility and we no longer want to carry our own burden. And as we look to the government for answers and to take care of us, individuals seek to collectivize their responsibility. But there is no collective liberty and no collective rights. Let me say that again. All rights are individual rights. These are individual liberties. But remember also, again, go back, democracy says otherwise. Democracy claims collective rights, and that precludes independent thought as well. There is only the collective, and it is always right. And it has no responsibility to guarantee rights because its only responsibility is to the collective. And if you disagree with the collective or the sovereign or the general will or the government, guess what? Remember, you are wrong. If you disagree with the collective, you are wrong. You don't have the right to be an independent thinker. To be wrong, you are just forced to agree with the collective. The government, the collective, the ones in power are always right in a democracy. Civil liberties are the rights of the individual. So if civil liberties or rights exist, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of protest, the right to life, and the pursuit of happiness, they are individual rights. And the founders of this country, in their wisdom, codified these natural rights we've been talking about into the very fabric of this country and its guiding documents. So if civil liberties and civil rights exist, these are natural rights based upon natural law. And thus, there appears to be recognition of the value of the individual within natural law. This should be obvious. Is it? Is it obvious? Was it obvious before I spelled it out? Could you follow the logical argument there? Are there some people out there who still cannot see what I think is so obvious, where I thought I laid it out in a logical fashion, but you still can't see it? Either way, I hope you'll join us next time for Chapter 6, The Obvious Turned Obscene.